Isa, have you finished that file I requested yet? Almost there, sir, just putting on the final touches. At first, the bumping was just a slight bother, a soft, steady vibration that was easily overlooked. Aya Morren remained glued to her computer, where a partially drafted pitch flickered as a lone patch of sanity within the cold corporate interior of the Ashborne Industries jet. Even without glancing over, she could feel his heavy energy radiating from the opposite seat. Her superior, Sebastian Ashborne, possessed a freezing, methodical aura that filled the cabin like a slow-moving ice sheet. He lacked any hint of flashiness or noise. He simply existed as a mute center of gravity clad in bespoke wool, with slate-colored eyes that judged the worth of everything they touched, usually finding it wanting. A chill always clung to him, carrying notes of high-end cedar fragrance and crisp ironed fabric. Suddenly, the trembling shifted. The steady pulse vanished, replaced by a brutal, savage heave that threw Aya hard into her safety restraints. Her computer tumbled away, hitting the deck with a gut-wrenching snap. She jerked her gaze upward. Sebastian sat motionless, though his hands clamped onto the chair supports until his joints turned pale. His facial muscles set into a rigid, merciless mask. Then a deep, throat-like rumble emerged, a moan echoing from the plane's internal frame. It sounded like a alloy buckling under a strain far beyond its limits. The smooth engine drone faltered, choked, and then one turbine cut out entirely. That instant quiet felt far more terrifying than the previous racket. Then the craft plummeted. This wasn't a descent. It was as if the floor had simply dissolved into a void. 1 second, they drifted through a peaceful azure heaven. The next, the cabin floor fell away. Ayla felt her insides lurch violently upward. A searing, bitter surge of terror hit her. A shriek stayed lodged in her lungs, feeling like a taloned beast. Looking out, the view was no longer tranquil. The horizon became a dizzying, chaotic smear of emerald and sapphire at a lethal slant. Utter bedlam broke out inside. A sharp, grating siren began to wail without mercy. Luggage bins flew wide, vomiting coats and suitcases like the viscera of some dying creature. The screech of iron buckling and shredding filled the air, physically battering her eardrums. It was the acoustic signature of total annihilation. Ayla gripped her seat, fingers clawing into the expensive hide as she sought some stability in a reality that was falling apart. Her thoughts, typically structured and artistic, dissolved into a blinding fog of sheer dread. Unlike a film, there were no parting remarks or cinematic drops, just a lack of time for any last-ditch pleas. Only the savage, all-encompassing plunge remained. She risked a glance sideways. Sebastian's gaze locked onto her own. In one horrific pulse, his facade crumbled. The icy executive and ruthless businessman she despised had evaporated. He was merely human now, eyes blown wide by the same basic survival instinct gripping her. A brutal, honest link formed between them as they both stared into the coming darkness. Then reality detonated in a roar of sheer power. The crash hit like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from her body and vibrating through her very bones. A massive thunder of tearing steel echoed one last time before consciousness finally faded into total darkness. Stillness. That was her first sensation, an intense buzzing void of sound that felt more unsettling than the previous chaos. A heavy rhythmic pulsing hammered inside Aya's skull. She squinted, trying to steady her blurry sight. The metallic tang of blood coated her tongue. Gradually, the wreckage came into view. Mangled steel shards of glass and a massive limb that had pierced the cabin wall just a hair away from her temple. The pungent sting of aviation fuel blended with the earthy aroma of dirt and broken evergreens. She had actually survived. Survival offered no comfort. Instead, it triggered a new surge of choking dread. She struggled for oxygen, her chest searing with every jagged intake. Her fingers shook wildly while she clawed at the safety strap. The metallic snap of the release echoed like a pistol firing in the eerie stillness. Escape was the only thought. She crawled out of the chair, her torso a map of sharp, stinging pain. The cabin sat at a sickening slant strewn with remnants of their flight, a mess of cards, a tipped crystal glass, and a lonely wingtip. Shoving through a jagged breach in the hull, she navigated sharp edges and frayed cables. Once clear of the ruins, her legs failed, dropping her onto the wet forest floor. The woods were thick, forming a massive, unfeeling sanctuary of emerald. The wilderness pulsed with life, completely and frighteningly alien. Then a faint human moan reached her. Aya spun toward the noise, her pulse racing frantically. A short distance away, propped against a massive old tree, sat Sebastian Ashborne. For 2 years, this man's icy detachment had been the shadow over her career. Blood stained his skin. That flawless dark blazer, his usual suit of armor, was ripped open at the shoulder. A jagged cut above his brow leaked crimson, the fluid trailing down his face before splashing onto the black earth below. Yet the injury wasn't the most jarring part. It was his face. Since her first day at the company, she'd never seen him look so powerless. His defensive walls had disintegrated. There were no commands being barked, no characteristic looks of frozen disdain. He merely gasped for air, trying to find his bearings. When he looked up, a surge of pure, unfiltered awareness linked them. This wasn't thanks or comfort. It was a mutual understanding of the horror they'd escaped. "Are you injured?" He wheezed, his tone sharp despite the gravel. He sounded determined rather than terrified. Aya shook her head, his words snapping her out of her daze. I'm okay, I think." She sounded weak, like she didn't recognize her own speech. Sebastian attempted to stand, but his balance failed as he wobbled. Acting on impulse, Ayla hurried over to support him, her fingers clamping onto his bicep. An electric jolt hit her before she could process the contact. They had never made physical contact, not even a polite greeting. Under her hand, the high-end wool felt coarse, covering an arm that felt like solid rock. Solid. "I appreciate it," he whispered, his tone carrying a gentleness she had never encountered before. They lingered for a heartbeat amidst the haunting silence of the woods as the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves finally returned. Sebastian surveyed the area, his mind already formulating the strategy. Allah observed, his expression hardened, shifting from a victim of the crash to a calculated leader. "We must look for other survivors," he stated, his voice reclaiming its natural authority. This felt different. It wasn't a command, but a simple truth shared with her, as if he were seeking her agreement. Issa gave a faint nod, her thoughts still spinning. Together they navigated the debris, shouting names that were met with nothing but an empty, ringing silence. They were utterly alone. As the gravity of their situation hit her, Aya felt as though the very ground beneath her was tilting once more. Trapped in the wilderness, without a way to call for help, they were stranded. To make matters worse, her only companion was the man she absolutely loathed. Sebastian faced her, using a ragged cuff to wipe a streak of blood from his forehead. As their eyes met, Aya saw a look that terrified her more than the fall. It was a look of pure, unbreakable resolve. "We will survive this," he muttered, his voice sounding as solid and grounded as the earth itself. "That is a vow." In that moment, Aya realized a disturbing truth: she actually believed him, and really anyone in her position would have. After dodging death like that, you would trust anyone promising a way out. "We shall see if he delivers." The fire was their first bit of luck. Ayla watched in total disbelief as Sebastian Ashborne lowered himself onto the damp, mossy earth of the forest floor. With an intense clinical focus, he used a piece of wreckage to strip bark from a branch, gathering, kindling with a fluid efficiency that was almost hypnotic to witness. Those hands had previously only ever signed off on multi-million-dollar mergers or drafted cold, dismissive emails that could end a professional career in under 10 words. Now they were covered in grime and raw from labor working to pull heat from timber and friction. He didn't utter a single complaint. He didn't even vent his frustration with a sigh. He simply worked. "Where did you learn how to do that?" She hadn't meant to ask, and her voice sounded tiny in the vast stillness of the woods. He remained focused on the task, his concentration unbroken. Under his tattered, rolled-up sleeve, his forearm muscles tightened as he vigorously rubbed a wooden stick against a base he had carved out. "It was my father," he replied flatly, his deep tone blending with the rhythmic scraping of the wood. He felt a person ought to be self-sufficient, using only nature's gifts. A slender trail of gray smoke drifted into the air. Ayla held her breath. Sebastian leaned closer, offering a soft, protective breath to nurture the heat. A solitary coal brightened, a tiny sign of hope in the dusk, followed by more, until a delicate fire finally flickered into existence. The flame danced within the hollow of his hands. He stared at it, and in the warm amber glow, Aya saw the tension in his frame finally ease. He had successfully banished the shadows. For a man she'd spent so long loathing, he was proving to be remarkably capable in a crisis, wasn't he? Beside the ruins, they set up a basic base, creating a small sanctuary of order against the chaotic, untamed surroundings of the wild. Sebastian took charge with a methodical precision that felt both strange and comforting. He managed to recover a large, mostly intact piece of the cabin's interior paneling. Using some wiring he'd salvaged from a chair, he constructed a temporary shelter between two sturdy trees. Ayla attempted to assist, but her efforts felt clumsy and amateurish. He stayed several moves ahead of her for every chore, While she gathered sticks, he had already located a much better source of dry wood. Her attempts to organize their supplies were overshadowed by his immediate focus on hydration and heat. Are you familiar with a taut line hitch? He posed the question while gripping a piece of rope he'd found. I'm not, she confessed, a wave of her usual insecurity hitting her. That's fine. Let me teach you. And he did. Positioned at her back, he calmly walked her through the various loops and tugs required to secure the knot. His proximity allowed his body heat to combat the evening chill. A lingering trace of his high-end fragrance now mixed with the pungent aroma of smoke on his skin. As he tightened the rope, his skin grazed hers, sending a sudden electric sensation surging through her entire being. She recoiled instantly as though touched by a coal. Why the sudden change? She blurted out, her emotions laid bare. He froze. Glancing over, his silhouette looked jagged in the gathering dark. In what way? Just not yourself. Releasing his hold, Sebastian squared his shoulders toward her. He studied her for a while, those slate-colored eyes giving nothing away in the shifting orange glow. Exhaling heavily, he took a seat on a fallen tree by the hearth. Back in the city, I play the role the directors demand, he admitted, watching the embers. I am the product of my uncle's grooming, following my parents' passing. He stopped the mention of that man casting a shadow. Out here, that persona is useless. Forget the executives and the market shares. None of that exists now. He waved a hand at the oppressive forest. There is only staying alive. When darkness fell, the mercury dropped. A biting wet frost rose from the earth, aggressive and impossible to ignore. Aya sat close to the hearth, hugging her knees, yet an unstoppable, bone-deep trembling took hold of her. Clamping her jaw shut, she vowed not to display any vulnerability. Yet he saw. Sebastian Ashborne was never one to miss a detail. Silently he rose, shed his shredded blazer, his final defense against the elements, and approached her. He offered the garment. I can't take that, she argued, her words shaky from the cold. You'll freeze. My body heat is higher. He stated it plainly. Sebastian addressed Aya. His tone was unwavering, silencing her objections, though the characteristic coldness was noticeably absent. He spoke with total conviction. Claw. Seeing his authentic worry a stark contrast to his usual facade of detached power, she simply stared up at him. In that moment, her deep-seated resentment underwent a massive change. Reaching out with a hesitant motion, she finally accepted the piece of clothing. She draped it over her shoulders. The cloth remained warm from his skin, smelling of tobacco timber and his own distinct nameless essence. It served as a protective barrier. With a sharp nod, he retreated to his side of the embers, hugging himself to ward off the biting air. Ayla tracked him, a sharp ache tightening in her chest. She felt a messy blend of remorse, thanks, and a third unknown emotion. A feeling far more glowing and perilous. I appreciate it, she murmured across the glowing coals. He merely bowed his head, eyes heavy with a weariness so deep it seemed to crush him. Issa couldn't find rest. She watched the fire dance and pop a solitary light against the suffocating sentient dark of the woods. Her gaze stayed on Sebastian. He was trembling. He tried to mask it with small, rigid motions. Yet in the flickering, harsh firelight, she saw the shivers racking his frame. Before hesitation or logic could stop her, she stood up. Gripping the coat, she circled the flames and settled beside him. The earth felt frozen and unforgiving beneath her. What are you up to? He murmured, voice thick with exhaustion, eyes shut as they shared the space. She pulled the coat over both of them like a makeshift quilt, huddling close until their frames touched. The shared warmth was immediate. Sebastian's eyes snapped open. They looked like dark voids reflecting the flickering orange light. He glanced at her, then the covering, then back to her face. You didn't have to. I'm aware. A heavy quiet followed, broken only by the crackling wood and the far-off cry of a night hunter. Then, with a slowness that was almost imperceptible, he slumped against her, a tiny shift. A realization of giving in. Ayla's pulse began a wild, heavy thumping against her ribs. She felt every point where they met, his shoulder on hers, his leg against hers, his constant, solid weight. She used to despise Sebastian Ashborne. For 2 years, she had built her career on the foundation of that very hatred. It was reliable and firm. But this shivering man beside her, the one who gave up his final layer of warmth for her, the man now leaning on her in trust, she realized she didn't know him at all. Sitting there sharing a coat and a bit of heat under strange stars, a terrifying realization took root in her mind. She wasn't entirely sure she felt any hatred for him anymore. Issa woke to the scent of cooked fish and foreign bird calls. Briefly, her mind clung to memories of her soft mattress, her tiny flat, and the city's roar. Then the weight of her current reality hit her hard. The throbbing in her back from the rocky soil, the morning chill, and Sebastian's heavy coat still over her. She sat up feeling rigid. Past the dying coals, Sebastian knelt by a small, clear brook she hadn't spotted before. He was rotating two small, silver-scaled fish on sticks over a small fire he'd revived from last night's embers. "You caught breakfast?" Her voice sounded thin. He looked back, and for the first time, Aya saw something she thought Sebastian Ashborne was incapable of a grin. Not his usual shark-like business smile. This was tiny, tentative, almost bashful. It barely moved his mouth, but it brightened his gaze. "Got up early," he muttered, voice gravelly. "Found the stream about 200 yards that way." Ayla blinked, brushing messy hair from her eyes. "And you grabbed fish with your bare hands." "Just making do," he replied casually, as if it were simple. He grabbed a skewer, the fish skin crackling perfectly. "Eat up, we need our strength." They slipped into a silent habit, a flow set by the sun and their basic need to stay alive. It was an odd, quiet alliance. Sebastian, with his grim determination, handled camp security and searched for an exit. He acted as the provider and guard. Ayla, despite her design degree, used her secret childhood love of plants to become the gatherer. Just like that, their professional hierarchy vanished. They became something new, forged in the fires of survival. It's striking how people transform when society disappears, isn't it? She started scouting the local greenery. Her grandmother's wisdom rang in her head. She located wide, waxy leaves that could serve as shingles for their shelter. She picked out edible tubers, carefully matching them against mental images from her grandmother's old journals. She even discovered a plant with pulpy leaves known for its healing qualities. "Where'd you learn this?" Sebastian asked later. He sat still on a trunk while she tended to the cut on his brow, which was looking red and swollen. "My grandmother taught me," Aya replied softly, focused on her work. She'd ground the leaves into a pulp exactly as she'd been shown. She believed the earth provides every cure if you look closely. He stayed silent while she worked his stillness, making her own heart feel deafening. She was incredibly close, even more than when he'd shown her how to tie the rope. She felt the heat from his body and saw the dark stubble on his jaw, plus a tiny hidden scar near his brow she'd never noticed. She noticed how his eyes followed her every move. Her touch was soft as she spread the medicine on his wound. Once finished, her hand stayed a heartbeat too long, her thumb grazing his temple. His breathing hitched as their gazes locked. The thin mountain air suddenly felt heavy, humming with a fresh and volatile tension. Ayla jerked her hand back, her pulse racing, and stepped away. Later that day, while collecting wood deeper in the brush, Sebastian froze. He raised a hand, his posture turning sharp. "Hark," Ayla went still, straining to hear. "What is it?" The quiet. She listened closely, and then it hit her. The avian symphony had vanished into thin air. Not even the faint scurrying of forest floor dwellers remained. An eerie hush blanketed the woods. It wasn't the peace of nature, but a suffocating tension, as if the earth itself had frozen in fear. "Sebastian," she breathed. A cold tingle raced down her spine, her instincts screaming a warning before her logic caught up. "Get behind me," he commanded. Aya pressed her spine against his, watching the shadows shift, while he scoured the thicket. Then the discovery-heavy impressions sunken into the riverside silt. The tracks were massive, dwarfing her palm with jagged gouges carved deep into the grime. "What on earth could leave a mark that size?" she stammered. Sebastian crouched low, his hand tracing the edge of the indentation with a stony look. "A predator," he muttered. "A big cat." The implication hung heavy between them. Both were well aware of the hunters stalking these reaches, mountain lions or worse. They retreated to their clearing in a feverish, quiet rush. Though he said nothing, Sebastian's urgency was clear as he stoked the flames into a towering wall of light. Taking a jagged shard of salvaged debris, he began grinding its tip against a river stone, forging a primitive but lethal pike. "We're splitting the night into shifts," he declared, his tone steady, yet carrying an authority that brooked no debate. "I'll take the opening watch, then swap with you." Aya simply gave a stiff nod, her throat too constricted for words. As the sun vanished, leaving the woods in a heavy shroud of black, rest felt like a fantasy. Every snapping twig or shifting leaf triggered a fresh surge of panic. Her mind conjured monsters within the dancing shadows just beyond the light. That was when the sound reached her. A faint but unmistakable rumble echoed through the dirt, a low, vibrating snarl that spoke of raw, lethal dominance. Aya's eyes snapped wide. Bolting upright, she found Sebastian already standing, his makeshift weapon gripped tight as his frame blocked the firelight. He stared into the void beyond their camp, his focus absolute. "Stay perfectly still," he murmured, his voice barely a breath. Her lungs froze, her limbs locked by sheer terror. Then for a fleeting heartbeat, she caught a glimpse. A pair of amber orbs shimmered like burning coals in the dark, reflecting the orange glow. It was a panther calculating its next move. With a single deliberate stride, Sebastian positioned himself as a shield between Aya and the beast, a lone barrier against the encroaching gloom. "The moment I shout, you flee," he hissed, his focus never wavering from the spot where those eyes had vanished. "Do you hear me?" "I won't leave you," she started, but he turned slightly, his face appearing as if carved from granite. "Swear it." Moisture stung her eyes. Before the words could form, the creature emerged from the veil of night. Its lithe, dark form glided into the light. The massive feline stepped forward, but Sebastian didn't cower. Instead of lunging with the steel, he chose a different weapon, the flame. In a blur of motion, he reached into the pit, seized a flaming bough, and pitched it directly at the panther's paws. The wood struck with a burst of embers and a sharp crackle. The great cat flinched back, a furious hiss erupting as its golden eyes burned with rage. "Back off!" Sebastian bellowed, a raw, guttural shout that seemed to vibrate through the very timber of the forest. Aya watched in shock as the composed executive she once knew shed his skin, becoming something primal and fierce, a true guardian. He didn't pause, grabbing more blazing timber and throwing them in a wide arc to create a flickering barrier between them and the beast. The black cat prowled the perimeter, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur like a dark living shadow. Caught between its hunger and an ancient dread of the heat, the creature let out one final bone-chilling cry of defeat. With a twitch of its tail, the hunter dissolved back into the gloom. Though it had vanished, Aya felt its presence lingering nearby. It was out there lurking. The remaining hours were a blur of terror. Sebastian remained upright, refusing to yield an inch. He stood watch at the light's edge, fingers white-knuckled around his pike, his eyes never ceasing their sweep of the blackness. He kept the bonfire roaring, a lone sentry against the night's horrors. Aya fought to stay conscious, the taste of fear lingering in her throat. But the toll of the last few days finally broke through. Despite the panic, her vision blurred and her chin began to dip. She eventually collapsed against a fallen trunk, drifting into a restless slumber, haunted by glowing amber eyes and razor-sharp fangs. She stirred to the pale light of morning bleeding through the leaves. Sebastian hadn't moved. He was still on guard. He leaned against a trunk, his weapon resting nearby, yet his frame remained tense, his focus still locked on the surrounding brush. "You never closed your eyes," she said, rising with a mix of shame and wonder. "It wasn't an option," he rasped. "Sebastian, you need sleep." "I can manage," he insisted, but the shake in his hands and his sunken eyes betrayed him. As he stepped away from the support, his fatigue became undeniable. He stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady himself. Aya moved quickly to catch his arm. "You're at your limit. Rest now and I'll take over the lookout duty. You don't understand. I can tend to fire and I can scream if something moves," she countered firmly. "Let me handle this for a few hours." He studied her, his stubborn resolve clashing with a body that was clearly failing him from lack of sleep. Finally, he let out a weary breath and gave a stiff nod. He collapsed onto the bed of leaves, though his mind still seemed to be on high alert. He stayed there, his frame still rigid, eyes partially shut, his breathing coming in thin, shallow gasps. "I'm unable," he admitted, his voice a low, gravelly sound of pure defeat. "I can't just shut it off." Without a thought or a moment's hesitation, Ayla dropped to the earth right beside him. Then she did something that stunned them both. She reached out and grasped his hand. Sebastian went completely motionless. His eyes snapped wide in shock, locking onto hers with sudden intensity. His palm felt icy against hers, yet his grip was firm, his long fingers toughened by years of hard labor. "I'm right beside you," Aya whispered, her voice a soft anchor in the morning. "Nothing will happen. I'll watch while you rest." He stared down at their joined hands as if he were seeing a miracle for the first time. Then so gradually it was nearly impossible to see his fingers tightened, interlacing with hers. The bond felt heavy and real. "Why would you do this?" he breathed, his eyes lifting to meet her face. Ayla had no logical answer, or perhaps she did, and that's what truly frightened her. "Because you'd do the same for me." She finally whispered the words, carrying more truth than anything she had said in years. A flicker of something, gratitude, shock, perhaps relief, softened his jagged features. For the first time since the plane slammed into the earth, he let his guard drop. His lids finally fluttered shut. With her hand anchoring his, he eventually drifted into sleep. 3 hours later, Aya remained perched beside him, leaning against a fallen tree, her own exhaustion a dull, distant throb. She watched the steady rhythm of his chest. She saw how slumber smoothed the harsh edges of stress from his face, making him look younger, almost fragile. Her hand stayed in his and she felt no urge to move. When Sebastian finally stirred, the sun was high above, casting dappled patterns of light through the thick forest canopy. He blinked in confusion, and the first thing he seemed to notice was the warmth of her hand still gripping his. He looked at their entwined fingers, then at her. Neither person made an effort to pull away. "I appreciate it," he muttered, his voice thick with sleep and an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Any time Aya heard herself say the word, feeling both reckless and absolutely right. In that quiet stillness, something fundamental between them completely shifted. They were no longer just a boss and his assistant. They weren't even merely survivors. They were something else, something far riskier, something inevitable. Sebastian slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, but he didn't let go of her hand. "Aya," he began, his tone turning grave. "I need to tell you something." Her heart gave a sharp, painful jolt. "What?" He opened his mouth, then shut it, struggling for words. "Back at the firm, the man I was—" He paused, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. "I never intended to be that person, especially around you. I just forgot how to be anything else." "Why?" she breathed. "Because I was taught that empathy equals weakness, that power requires coldness, that an Ashborne must never reveal." His voice broke before he could finish the thought. "Reveal what?" she nudged softly. Sebastian looked up, and in the raw, exposed depths of his stare, Aya finally saw the truth. The crushing isolation, the burden of a destiny he never chose. The frigid, hollow fortress he had constructed around his very soul. "That he actually gives a damn," he eventually uttered, and Aya's world, already shattered, once felt like it was shifting on its axis all over again. Later that day, the heavens opened up. This wasn't some light drizzle, it was a violent deluge, a massive wall of water that pounded the forest ceiling. The crude shelter Sebastian had cobbled together shook under the pressure, and within moments, freezing rain began to seep, then pour through the cracks. The embers hissed and died, or losing their fight against the downpour before vanishing with a final gasp, leaving their tiny camp in a heavy total darkness. They were drenched in a heartbeat. A freezing, soul-deep chill took hold, far more agonizing than the previous night's cold. "We need to maintain body heat," Sebastian stated, his voice sharp against the howling storm. "Hypothermia will kill us." He didn't ask for her permission. He dragged her to the least wet spot in the hut, blocking the wind with his frame and pulling her flush against his chest. Isla didn't fight him. Her limbs were shivering violently, her teeth rattling so hard it physically hurt. His frame, though wet, felt like a burning furnace. They huddled together, two lost souls gripping one another, to survive the boundaries between them fading in the desperate struggle to stay alive. And within that roaring shadow, pressed together against the elements, Sebastian finally began to speak. "I lost my parents when I was 15. He murmured, his voice a steady anchor amidst the chaotic wind and rain. "A crash. My uncle took me in. He grabbed the company too." Ayla listened silently, her head resting against his heart, feeling the low rumble of his voice through his skin. Every sentence felt like a confession, another fragment of a mystery she was only just starting to piece together. "He insisted I'd be ruthless, claiming the world is full of sharks and any soft spot would get me killed." He inhaled sharply. "So I adapted. I learned to build barricades. I learned to view everything as a deal. I learned to never show that anything or anyone actually mattered." He moved slightly, pulling her closer. "At work, you looked at me as if I were some beast." Aya's heart ached. And you were right." He interrupted her, his voice rough with pure self-hatred. "I was. My uncle's rule was fear and respect beat being liked and seen as weak." Sebastian paused, his icy fingers finding her jawline, his thumb brushing her cheek. That simple, soft touch was a complete contrast to the howling wind outside. "Out here, I can't keep the mask on anymore. I despise the person I've become, but I've forgotten how to be anything else." Ayla took his hand, pressing his palm against her face. "Perhaps you don't need to learn," she whispered. "Maybe you just need to remember. Think back to the boy you were before he told you who to be." She waited, eyes scanning the gloom to find his. This was the man who would fight a predator for another's sake. The guy who would endure a freezing night. That is the true you, Sebastian, not some corporate machine. Their world narrowed to that small, fragile pocket of space. Sebastian gazed at her, searching her features for a sign, seeking consent or forgiveness, perhaps. I loathed you, Ayla blurted out. Her confession flowed like the surging storm. Back then I couldn't stand you. You were cold, bossy, and never grateful. Just a soulless suit. She gasped for air. But you aren't. You're keeping me alive, teaching and shielding me. Now I'm lost because everything I believed was a lie. Sebastian winced, eyes shut tight as if her words physically hurt. Ayla, please let me explain. She cupped his face, making him meet her gaze. You aren't who I imagined. It scares me because I finally see you. And you're... She searched for the word. Incredible. He caught his breath. I'm not. You are. Well, Ayla, you don't get it. If we make it back, I must return to that role. My family and the board expect it. Then refuse, she insisted fiercely. Don't go back. Be this real man, not their puppet. He looked at her in pure awe. It felt as if she had offered him everything. What if the real me is lost forever? He whispered, raw and broken. Ayla gave a soft, kind smile. My grandmother claimed that as long as you're breathing, there is time to find yourself. You just have to choose it. Rain drummed rhythmically against their camp, but an internal tempest was rising. Sebastian leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. Their breath mingled in the biting chill. If I kiss you, he rasped desperately, there is no turning back. I can't act like it never happened. Ayla's heart hammered. Then don't act, she breathed against his lips. Sebastian finally gave in and kissed her. It wasn't soft. It was a desperate, starving kiss, like a man finding water after a long drought. It was heavy with fear, hope, and survival. Ayla surrendered to him, fingers knotting in his damp hair, matching his intensity with her own. The kiss tasted of rain and endurance. When they eventually parted, gasping for air, he kept her close. He pulled her against his chest, holding on to her, like the only certain thing in a crumbling world. I am done being that person, he whispered into her hair, a vow to the storm. For once, I'm making my own choice. That night, as the rain purified the woods, two strangers bonded. Neither the forest nor civilization could break what happened. By morning, the rain ceased, leaving the woods shimmering. A fresh determination sat between them. That kiss shifted their reality. The previous tension had vanished, replaced by the quiet humming pulse of a shared, undeniable connection. Sebastian finally spoke. We can't stay, he noted, scanning the thick brush. We are too visible and running out of time. He gestured toward a distant, jagged summit against the dawn. We need to reach the peak. A massive signal fire there is our only real shot. Ayla looked at the mountain. It seemed impossibly steep and far. Can we actually do it? Sebastian turned, his fingers intertwining with hers in a natural protective grip. Together, he vowed. Yes, that single word brought a rush of heat to her chest, killing the morning cold. They spent the day getting ready. Their dynamic had shifted. It was no longer a leader and a follower, but a synchronized partnership. They shared small grins and light brushes, a hand on a shoulder, or touching fingers while swapping tools. He made 2 packs. They packed their meager supplies, a bottle of rainwater, some wild roots, the spear, and their fire-starting gear. You've changed, Ayla noted while fixing his pack strap. He stopped, looking directly at her. So have you. How? At the office, he whispered. You always looked tense, like you were trying to disappear or take up no room. His gaze softened with a gentle gray warmth. Out here, you actually come alive. Ayla felt her face flush. Maybe because here, I'm not just a ghost in design. I actually matter. You always mattered, Sebastian said gravely. I was just blind. The start of the hike was surprisingly simple. The ground was mostly flat, and the slope was barely noticeable. But as they climbed, the forest darkened. Thick branches wove together, hiding the sun. The woods grew silent and watchful. Then she saw. Sebastian, she choked out in a whisper. He was by her side instantly, muscles coiled. What's wrong? With shaking hands, she pointed down. Tucked into the moss was a yellowed, weathered bone, unmistakably from a human. A leg bone. Sebastian felt his pulse freeze. That is impossible. Before he could finish, his foot hit something solid, not wood or stone. A loud metallic snap echoed and his world inverted. Ayla's throat went raw with a cry when Sebastian was suddenly hoisted upward, a heavy corded trap snapping shut around his leg. He hung there, swinging 3 meters above the forest floor like some macabre clock weight. Sebastian, she wailed, rushing his way. Stay back! He barked, his tone thick with agony and a sudden chilling desperation. Ayla, just go. Leave now. No way, I won't abandon you. Then a sound cut through the air. Percussion. A relentless thumping pulse. It started faintly but intensified as her own pulse raced in terror. Sebastian's features, already ashen, turned completely ghostly. Ayla, pay attention. Find cover immediately. I'm not going alone. Please, his voice cracked, dripping with sheer hopelessness. If they catch us both, it's over for everyone. Stay hidden until the danger passes. I'll find a way out. I won't let you rot here, she wept, her thoughts spinning. I'll return, Ayla, I swear it. She had already retreated, ducking behind a giant twisted trunk and flattening herself against its jagged surface. Her chest thudded so hard it felt like her ribs might snap, echoing the advancing beat. A chilly perspiration soaked through her clothes. The sharp survival skills she'd developed recently were sounding alarms. Pure, ancient human threat. The thumping grew deafening and more demanding. Then the figures stepped out, materializing from the foliage like woodland ghosts. They wore rough pigments and pelts, their identities hidden by wooden masks with vacant, haunting gazes. They held lances headed with jagged flint. It was a clan, a group never before reached by the outside world. They crowded around Sebastian's suspended form, muttering a deep, raspy incantation in a tongue Ayla didn't recognize. A warrior nudged the rope using his spear's end, sending him swaying. Their laughter rang out cold and devoid of mirth. Then, with smooth, habitual precision, a man used a flint blade to sever the line. Sebastian slammed into the dirt with a dull, heavy crash. Before he could catch his breath, they swarmed him, tethering his limbs with coarse, braided vines. Ayla pressed her palm against her lips to kill a sob. The men lifted Sebastian onto their backs and retraced their steps, the rhythm and singing starting up again. As the thick foliage swallowed them, Ayla caught one final glimpse of Sebastian's expression. He craned his neck, searching the shadows until his gaze locked onto her position. He wasn't afraid. Instead, his eyes issued a quiet, frantic order. Live. Ayla lost all sense of time while pinned against that bark, paralyzed. An hour might have passed, or perhaps just a few moments. Her entire reality narrowed to her labored gasps and the chaotic thumping inside her chest. He was lost to her, snatched away. This jungle, once merely a vast and lonely place, now seemed predatory and full of unbeatable threats. An icy, biting terror took hold of her. Her chest ached, and every breath felt like she was drowning on dry land. She was spiraling into a panic attack, her system surging with fight-or-flight energy. Every nerve told her to flee and vanish. Yet a memory pierced through the fright, Sebastian shielding her from the big cat, using himself as a human barrier. Sebastian keeping watch through the darkness, a lonely sentinel. Sebastian holding her close in the downpour, kissing her like it was his last moment on earth. A savage, protective fire flared within her, burning away the dread. I'm getting you back. That internal promise became her anchor. Shaking but determined, she stepped away from her cover. Action was required immediately. Tracking the group's path proved hauntingly simple. They hadn't bothered to cover their tracks, leaving snapped twigs, muddy footprints, and bits of torn rope in their wake. They traveled their territory with the swagger of top-tier hunters. Each cracking branch made Ayla jump, her pulse spiking with every sound. Still, she pressed on, repeating his name like a prayer while picturing his smile and the way his hand felt in hers. Redemption or death, there was no middle ground. The path opened into a massive cleared space. She fell to her stomach in the weeds, watching through a wall of greenery. The sight stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't just a camp. It was a vast community of grass-roofed buildings. Tendrils of smoke rose from numerous cooking pits, while scores of people went about their business, their chatter a strange, distant drone. Right in the heart of the settlement, bound to a heavy timber post in the ground, sat Sebastian. She choked back a cry, burying her face in the wet earth. He was still breathing, beaten and bleeding from a facial wound, but alive. Though slumped with fatigue, he eventually raised his chin to survey the surrounding woods. He was searching for her presence, clinging to the hope that she'd obeyed him and found safety. I'm coming for you, Ayla breathed into the wind, but the odds were impossible. One woman against an entire tribe armed with nothing but pointed branches and a wild idea. They possessed weapons and superior strength. She remained at the forest's edge for hours, her brain working overtime to find a weakness. Observing their routines, sentry rotations, and hidden corners, a strategy finally emerged. It was suicidal and foolish, a scheme fueled by sheer panic, but it was her only shot. A fragment of an old college lecture on human cultures drifted back into her memory. She thought of secluded clans, deep-seated myths in that lethal black cat, the same predatory beast that had stalked them throughout their ordeal. Her teacher once described how some people saw panthers as spectral entities rather than mere predators, angry ghosts returning for blood, phantoms of the fallen coming back to punish the survivors. Ayla couldn't be sure if these people felt the same, but it was her final gamble. She needed to bait the cat and lead that forest spirit right to their doorstep. Locating the creature proved surprisingly simple. Or maybe the stalker was already hunting her. She returned to the creek, her chest tight with a blend of resolve and sheer terror. While picking up smooth pebbles from the water, a heavy tension settled over her. A tingle ran down her spine, signaling that she was no longer alone. She pivoted cautiously, and there it sat. Less than 10 yards away, draped across a thick limb with lethal stillness, was the shadow-dark predator. The beast tracked her movements with chilling focus, its amber orb shimmering as its tail gave a faint rhythmic flick. Every fiber of Aya's being urged her to flee or find cover, yet she ignored her survival instincts to do something utterly reckless. Digging into her pocket, she hurled a pebble at the creature, not to cause pain, but to provoke its fury. That small rock struck wood right beside its paw. A deep guttural vibration erupted from the predator, rattling the very ground beneath her. With its ears pinned back, the hunt was on. "That's it," she mouthed, retreating toward the settlement with shaky, calculated steps. "Just follow me," she urged, tossing another stone even closer to the prowling shadow. The massive feline vaulted from the limb, hitting the dirt with a muffled, lethal grace, before baring its fangs, sending Aya into a dead sprint. She pushed her body to its absolute limit, gasping for air, while dodging tangled roots and jagged stones. Behind her, the rhythmic pounding of heavy paws sounded like a terrifying war drum, gaining ground with every heartbeat. The heat of its breath brushed her neck, and she could almost swear those sharp talons were already tearing into her skin. Suddenly, a warm orange glow peeked through the thicket, the flickering torches of the village fires. Channeling her last ounce of strength into a piercing shriek, she surged out of the brush and into the center of the village clearing. Driven by pure predatory instinct, the panther crashed in right behind her, sending the entire tribe into a frenzy of blind terror. To them, this wasn't just a cat. It was a living nightmare, a vengeful spirit draped in shadows and sharpened steel. Panic rippled through the crowd as people collided with cookware and each other, desperate to escape the carnage. Disoriented by the sudden bedlam, the beast lashed out in circles while Aya used the distraction to vanish from sight. Moving like a ghost amidst the turmoil, she crept toward her goal, staying low and focused on the man she came to save. Sebastian caught sight of her, his expression a frantic blur of shock and pure dread. "What on earth did you do?" He whispered this as she collapsed by his side, her nails tearing desperately at the rough cords binding him. "Getting you out," she wheezed. "Hold still. You've lost your mind," he hissed. "That monster is going to rip you apart." "He's occupied," she muttered, abandoning her broken nails to pry at the stubborn, grime-covered knots with her bare fingers. Her hands were a trembling mess of sweat and dirt, making the thick ropes feel impossible to unravel. "Please, just break," she pleaded. Another roar shook the air, much closer this time. "Go, Aya, save yourself," Sebastian begged through gritted teeth. "Hush and let me think." She barked, a fresh wave of panic-driven strength, finally forcing the main binding to snap. He kicked the remaining restraints away, grabbed her palm and shouted, "Move!" Together they bolted into the trees. The pitch-black woods welcomed them back, hiding their flight behind a wall of dense foliage and whip-like branches. Fear and an iron will to survive kept them moving as the screams and roars faded into the distance behind them. They sprinted until their chests felt like they were full of hot coals and their limbs turned a heavy, uncooperative lead. Only when the village sounds died out completely did they dare to consider slowing their frantic pace. Collapsing into a secluded ravine miles away, they lay there gasping, their frames racked with the violent tremors of an adrenaline crash. "You actually used a black leopard as a distraction." Sebastian wheezed, his voice thick with disbelief. A jagged mix of a sob and a chuckle escaped her. It felt like a solid plan at the time. He stared at her for a beat before lunging forward, crushing her in a hug so tight she could barely draw breath. Pressing his face against her, he felt her warmth. "You're completely deranged," he whispered. "I had a great teacher," she replied. Pulling back slightly, he cupped her mud-streaked face, his thumbs tracing the lines of her exhaustion. "You nearly died." "Same to you." Aya cut him off by placing her hands over his mouth. I knew you'd do it for me, she said softly. We're a team and teammates don't walk away from each other. His eyes brimmed with an emotion that looked suspiciously like tears as he echoed a team. They stayed hidden far from the reach of the tribe, resting in a freezing camp without so much as a spark to light the way. Huddled together against a rough trunk, their bodies provided the only warmth against the biting chill of the night. I really thought that was the end for us, she confessed into the darkness, her voice cracking. He squeezed her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a silent vow. After a long, heavy silence, he finally spoke. I love you, Aya. Time seemed to freeze, making the forest and the danger feel like a distant memory. Pardon? She turned to him, seeing his vulnerability laid bare under the soft glow of the stars. I mean it. Ever since we survived that wreck, seeing you pull through made me realize I wasn't alone anymore. I've always been solitary until now. Sebastian, you don't have to reciprocate, he blurted out, his throat tight with suppressed feeling. I just needed to say it because if we don't survive this, she cut herself off by kissing him. She channeled every bit of her terror relief and overwhelming, frightening affection into that embrace. It was a gesture that solidified every silent vow, every shared look, and every moment of hardship. When they finally pulled back, she was grinning through her tears. I love you back, she murmured. Now please try to avoid getting snatched by a murderous tribe from now on. He let out a genuine chuckle of relief that echoed through the quiet ravine. I'll give it my best shot. That evening in the center of a perilous, uncharted forest, they were miles from any city with a hostile group trailing them and no promise of help. For a brief window, they were completely perfectly happy. It was just a second, but it sufficed. Suddenly, a noise jerked Ayla from a heavy, dreamless slumber. The sound was mechanical and strange, a rhythmic thudding that sliced through the forest's natural harmony like a blade. Her eyes snapped open. It was a chopper. Sebastian, get up, she urged, shaking him hard. Wake up! He bolted upright instantly, alert, his muscles tense with a survivor's raw instinct. What's wrong? Ayla didn't speak. She simply gestured toward the sky. There it was, a dark silhouette against the low dawn clouds carving a path through the air. Help! They lunged to their feet and rushed into a small opening, flailing their arms wildly while screaming with hoarse voices, Down here! We're right here! The helicopter soared past, vanishing behind the thick tree line. Ayla's heart sank like a heavy lead weight in her chest. Please no, but then it doubled back. It was circling lower now, the thrumming of its blades echoing through the ravine. They were scouting the area. We're invisible to them, Sebastian noted, his mind racing. We need a signal, something that pops. Ayla scanned the clearing and spotted the shredded remnants of their homemade gear. The internal fabric was a faded yet unmistakable shade of emergency crimson. Teaming up, they ripped the material into the largest ribbons possible, laying them across the damp earth and pinning the edges down with heavy rocks. They fashioned a rough, desperate letter X on the ground. Then they stood back, staring upward as their pulses raced in sync with the spinning rotors. The bird made several more passes. Ayla held her breath, clutching Sebastian's hand so hard her knuckles turned white, and then it started to drop. The second her feet hit the metallic deck of the cabin, Ayla felt a surge of vertigo so intense she nearly doubled over. A uniformed crewman helped her to a bench as Sebastian sat beside her, never letting go of her hand. It was finished. 2 weeks, 14 days lost in a green nightmare that nearly killed them. The ordeal was over. A medic began his evaluation, speaking in a calm clinical tone, while asking about their wounds, dehydration levels, and mental state. But Ayla tuned him out. She was entirely focused on Sebastian, the warmth of his hand, and the surreal sensation of the vibrating floor beneath her. What happens now? The question was a haunting whisper in the back of her mind. The jungle had been their whole universe, a brutal but straightforward reality where they were teammates and lovers. But who would they be in civilization? Reading her thoughts, Sebastian gave her hand a firm squeeze. Nothing is changing, he murmured, his voice low and private. Yet they both realized that wasn't true. Everything was about to be different. Arriving at the medical center was a transition from one type of bedlam to another. As the doors slid open, they were met by a storm of flashes, yelling voices, and lenses shoved in their faces. Mr. Ashborne over here, how did you make it? Is it true there were other casualties on the plane? Sebastian, his expression stoic, tried to shoulder through the mob while shielding Ayla with his arm. However, a persistent tabloid journalist managed to bypass the guards. Mr. Ashborne, she shrieked, her voice cutting through the noise. Rumor has it you were trapped with a low-level staffer. Can you describe the nature of your bond out in the woods? Ayla felt him stiffen. This was the reckoning. She prepared herself for him to distance himself or offer a sterile corporate excuse to protect his image. It was the smart play, the typical move for a man like him. Instead, he halted. He turned and faced the wall of cameras head-on. The strobing lights highlighted his worn-out features, the fresh wounds, and the grime still smudged on his skin. He didn't look like a billionaire mogul. He looked like a soldier back from the front. Aya Morren is why I'm alive, he declared firmly, silencing the entire crowd. My presence here today is entirely due to her bravery and nothing else. She is the most courageous, brilliant, and stunning person I have ever known. He stopped finding her gaze through the media storm. And I love her. A stunned silence followed as everyone collectively held their breath. Ayla froze, her heart skipping a beat as the entire world dissolved until only his eyes remained. Then the chaos resumed, but the energy had shifted. Sebastian paid no mind to the frantic new wave of questions. He raised her hand for the world to see and offered a genuine, radiant grin to the cameras. A few quiet days later, their universe had shrunk to the four white walls of a private suite. Sebastian was healing, hooked to an intravenous line, a reminder of their struggle. Ayla remained in a chair by his side, a steadfast and constant companion. They hadn't discussed his public confession much. They didn't need to. It was an unspoken, permanent truth between them now. The door swung open unannounced. A man walked in, his arrival instantly chilling the room's atmosphere. He was an elder gentleman in a flawless suit, eyes like frozen glass. Ayla knew him immediately from corporate events and board meeting portraits. Richard Ashborne, the man who had sculpted Sebastian's cold persona, stood there. Get out, Richard muttered, his tone low and sharp. He ignored Aya completely, his eyes locked onto his nephew with a freezing anger. Sebastian propped himself up, his jaw set in a hard line. She's staying. Richard shut the door, the click sounding like a quiet threat. Have you completely lost your mind? He hissed. A public spectacle for a... He waved dismissively toward Aya, his gaze finally raking over her with blatant disrespect. For a mere staffer. Aya isn't a staffer, Sebastian countered, his voice sounding dangerously composed. Of course she is. That little stunt cost us 3 points in stock value. Investors are panicking. The board is doubting your sanity, thinking you've had a mental break. Sebastian moved his legs to the side of the hospital bed, standing to confront his uncle, oblivious to the tension on his intravenous line. Then let them doubt. Richard winced, looking genuinely blindsided. What? You heard me. I'm done living for the board, the shareholders, and you, Sebastian stated. Your time is over. You spent 17 years trying to turn me into your clone. A cold, calculating, and desperately lonely man. His voice wavered at the end. I'm not that person anymore. Aya watched him, her heart filled with a fierce, protective pride. The final wall was finally coming down. Richard's eyes snapped to Aya, his face twisted in loathing. This is your fault. You've brainwashed him. It's just Stockholm Syndrome, a trauma bond. You survived a nightmare together and confused it for love. I know what I feel. Sebastian cut in, his words sharp as glass. For the first time ever, I'm choosing what's real over what's expected. Richard let out a short, cynical laugh. How poetic. But let's be real. Without me, you're nothing. I control 40% of the voting power, plenty to oust you. Then do it. A heavy silence filled the room. Even Aya held her breath as the two men locked eyes in a standoff. A quiet war played out in that sterile space. Richard's eyes thinned. You're bluffing. Try me. Richard finally backed off, his face a mask of rage. You will regret this choice, Sebastian. Likely. Sebastian admitted, a sense of weary finality in his tone. But at least I'll be living my own life. Richard threw one last hateful look at Aya, promising revenge, then stormed out, slamming the door. The moment the door shut, Sebastian faltered, his strength vanishing. Aya was there instantly, steadying him with her hands on his shoulders. Are you okay? Yeah, He looked at her, eyes wide with a mix of pure dread and wild liberation. I think I just threw away my entire career. No, she whispered, cupping his face to meet his eyes. You chose yourself. What if it was a mistake? He asked softly, his fear showing. Then we'll build something new from the ground up, she promised. Together. Together, he echoed the word, feeling strange yet beautiful. He leaned into her, a genuine smile finally breaking through. It was a look of total freedom. Together, I could get used to that. Aya smiled back, her heart full of love for the brave man before her. Yet a tiny shadow of doubt remained in her mind. They beat the wilderness, but could they survive the real world? 2 weeks later, Sebastian met her at a quiet cafe near their old office. The place felt heavy with history, morning coffee runs and napkins filled with Aya's sketches. Back then, Sebastian was a cold, silent figure of power. Now everything had shifted. He wasn't her boss. She wasn't his assistant. They were an unknown. Aya got there 5 minutes early, her nerves tied in knots. He was already waiting by the window with 2 coffees. When he saw her, his face transformed with a bright, open smile that left her breathless. In that heartbeat, Aya realized they were going to be just fine. "I've got an idea for you," Sebastian began after they sat, his voice stripped of its corporate hardness. He was relaxed. Aya took a cautious sip. "I'm launching a new venture," he said, his gaze steady and focused. "Something smaller, something that belongs to me. No uncle, no board, no Ashborne legacy." He leaned in, his intensity locked on her. "And I want you as my partner." Aya nearly spat out her drink. "What? Equal partners. 50-50 split on everything. Real equals." "But Sebastian, I don't know the first thing about management," she stammered, her head spinning. "But you understand design. You create beauty and innovation." More importantly, he reached out his hand firm and warm over hers. "You know the real me, and I trust you more than anyone on earth." "Why do this?" she asked in a soft whisper. "Because the forest taught me I don't have to carry the world alone. You saved me in every way possible." He squeezed her hand. "Let me do this with you." Aya studied him. This wasn't the icy CEO or the desperate survivor. This was just Sebastian, real open and the man she loved. "I have one condition," she said, a smile forming. His eyes brightened. "Anything. We do it right. No shortcuts, no ruthlessness. We create something we're proud of, something meaningful." Sebastian's grin reached his eyes, the specific smile he reserved only for her. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They sealed their future not with ink, but with a firm handshake across the table. True to form, he reached across the table, sealing their pact with a tender, hopeful kiss that carried a hint of espresso and a fresh start. Over the next few months, Aura Designs came to life. They operated out of a cramped rental filled with used chairs and a brewer that groaned more than it made coffee. Compared to the sleek glass and marble of Ashborne Industries, it was a different universe, but it belonged entirely to them. Working side by side, they found a natural flow in their collaboration during those long nights. Passionate debates over typography and colors ended in celebrations with budget pizza and cold beers. A steady rhythm developed, merging their careers and romance perfectly, usually concluding with them curled up together on her modest living room couch. Tired yet fulfilled, a deep realization hit Aya. She hadn't merely outlasted the wilderness, she had been completely transformed by it. That timid, unnoticed creator was gone forever. A self-assured entrepreneur and partner had taken her place. She finally possessed a voice and a purpose. Late one evening, as their modest studio amidst a sea of drafts and textiles, Sebastian went still, his marker poised over a layout. "Alia?" She hummed, focused on her task. "Are you truly content?" The bluntness of it caught her off guard. She paused, looking directly into his soul. Her eyes traced the slight scars, a permanent trail of their ordeal. Yet she also noticed his newfound serenity and the relaxed way he carried himself. She recognized the man he had finally allowed himself to be. "I am," she whispered, her tone soft yet resolute. It was the honest truth. However, as he returned to his sketches with a grin, a lingering doubt she'd tucked away months ago began to stir again. A faint, nagging thought. They were business associates and soulmates, but where was this path actually leading them? Exactly 6 months after their rescue, Sebastian drove her back to the peaks. Not the same woods, never there again, but a park a few hours away, with clear paths and stunning vistas. "What's the occasion?" she questioned during the climb, feeling the crisp fall air and the reliable, firm ground under her boots. "A surprise," he replied, simply, a cryptic, playful smirk touching his face. He guided her to a high ridge overlooking a vast canyon. The descending sun streaked the horizon in vibrant shades of gold magenta and deep indigo. The sheer beauty of the landscape was breathtaking. Sebastian halted and turned to her. Right then, she caught a glimpse of it. He was shaking. His fingers twitched, and a raw, expectant look in his eyes sent her pulse racing with anticipation. The moment that jet crashed, he began, his tone deep and earnest, locked onto her gaze. "All I could think was how much of my life I'd squandered." Holding her breath, her fingers instinctively slipped into his. "I possessed wealth, fame, and influence. he added, his thumb tracing her skin. But I lacked anything of substance. No one truly saw me. He grasped both her hands. Until you appeared, suddenly the isolation vanished. You witnessed the real me, the flaws and the trauma, and you didn't flinch. You stood by me. You fought. You pulled me through. He released one hand and time seemed to freeze. He sank to one knee on the rough earth. Her heart skipped a beat. I can't predict what's coming, Aya, he confessed, his voice heavy with feeling. Whether the business thrives or falls apart doesn't matter. I don't know what hurdles we'll face next. He retrieved a small, unassuming velvet case. But I'm certain of one thing: I won't face any of it without you. He flipped it open. Tucked inside was a ring. It wasn't some massive, flashy gem like his old associates' wives wore. It was a graceful, understated band with a flawless stone that captured the sunset, scattering light into 1,000 shimmering prisms. Aya Morren, he said, his voice cracking as he wore his heart on his sleeve. Will you be my wife? Words failed her. Tears blurred her vision as she looked at him kneeling there. Driven by instinct, she reacted the only way she knew how. She knelt down to meet him, throwing her arms wide and kissing him with every ounce of her being. Is that a yes? He chuckled, wiping his own eyes. Yes, she breathed, her voice thick with joy. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the band onto her finger. A flawless fit. There on that peak with the horizon wide before them, the world finally clicked into place. Aura Designs flourished. While it never rivaled the scale of Ashborne Industries, it was something superior, honest, respected, and stable. It was theirs alone. They wed a year later in a quiet garden ceremony, surrounded only by the individuals who truly mattered to them. Her grandmother beamed with pride, joined by a handful of loyal friends who had witnessed their entire transformation. No media, no executives, no facades. During the party, as the golden hour bathed the small group in warmth, Sebastian stole her away. They stood near a soft water feature, the trickling sounds blending with the distant sounds of merriment. I've got a gift for you, he murmured, a playful spark in his gaze. He pulled a creased piece of paper from his pocket, a cocktail napkin. Our final agreement, he noted, handing it over. She opened it. In his bold script was one sentence: the final clause, party is Sebastian and party B. Aya hereby agree to cherish, honor, and survive whatever life brings together for the rest of their days. Below were 2 lines, one already bearing his signature. Aya's laughter, bright and full of pure happiness, rang out in the evening air. Your best work yet, she teased. He held out a pen. Want to make it binding? Braced against the cool stone of the fountain, she penned her name right next to his. Accepting the cloth, he creased it neatly before tucking it into his vest right over his heart. A bond for eternity, he murmured, his tone resonating with an endless, overwhelming devotion. Drawing her close, he shared a lingering, tender kiss that mirrored every hope they held for the years ahead. Their journey opened with a plummet from the heavens, a savage fight to stay alive against overwhelming, lethal circumstances. Yet it concluded right here with a simple, ink-stained scrap, living proof that losing every single thing is often the only path to finding what counts.